continue to talk about social psychological research, but this time let's talk about how we would test our ideas, specifically via different research designs. We're going to talk about 3 different research designs: descriptive research, correlational research, and experimental research. When it comes to descriptive research, it's really very straightforward. The goal is simply to describe people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and we can do that a variety of different ways. Observational studies would provide one way. When we're talking about observational studies, for purposes of our class, we're talking about studies in which behavior is actually observed. We're actually out there observing some type of behavior. This would be a great example right here. Here we see a researcher actually embedded essentially in a tribe of people, trying to learn about their culture, how it might be similar to or different from our own culture. In today's world, TV actually does a pretty good job sometimes of showing what is similar to observational studies done by social psychologists. Now, of course, when you look at the show like What Would You Do, it's very sensationalized, but this is not so far away from a typical social psychological study. In this particular episode, it was pretty interesting. There was a very attractive teacher. Of course, she was an actress, and then a young student, and they met in a restaurant. They were flirting, which of course is completely inappropriate. Onlookers saw what was going on. And of course, as a researcher, we'd be interested in people's reactions. We want to know how people feel about the situation, and specifically how many people are going to act and actually say something or do something to try to correct this inappropriate situation. And this lady is clearly upset. She's looking to see what's going on. At some point, she actually confronted this lady, and she asked her to go outside and have a word with her. And she said, "If you don't come outside and have a word with me, I'm going to call the police." And then later on, of course, the producers of the show had to debrief her and tell her what was going on. There are a lot of ethical issues with this type of study. I've seen a lot of people on this show get very upset. But this would be an example of an observational type of study. We're trying to observe what would happen in this situation. Archival studies would be another type of descriptive research. In archival studies, we're looking at historical data, so data that already exists, and we're trying to learn something new. And one of the most interesting studies that I've seen recently that involved archival research methods had to do with looking at historical data about presidents, our past presidents, and also speaking with historians who are experts about these presidents. And the whole point of the study was to try to determine the level of narcissism that our different presidents have had and try to determine who are the most narcissistic presidents. And it was really very interesting. When it comes to the recent presidents that we see in this picture, the only one who really made it to the list was Bill Clinton. He was listed as number 7. Number 1, just for your information, was Lyndon Johnson. But it was a fascinating study, and it used archival methods, as I mentioned. We were looking at past historical data. And what was the goal? Simply to describe these people and their behaviors and their thoughts involving narcissism. Surveys would be another method that we can use to go about doing some descriptive research. And when it comes to surveys, they're very common nowadays, but it's not necessarily easy to conduct surveys very well. All we were really doing in a survey is asking people to self-report, that's the key there, their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So we're observing what's going on, but the people are actually self-observing. They're providing us with their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Survey research is quick and easy. We talked previously about some of the problems like demand characteristics. Sometimes we will put the people in a situation where they have a sense of what we want to find in that type of research study, and they will respond in that way. We call those demand characteristics. Remember also that when people are responding, they might respond in a socially desirable type of way. So they're not really sharing their true thoughts and feelings, but they're responding in a way that makes them look good. And then, of course, the way we frame our questions can also influence the way that people respond to the questions. So we talked about some of those problems previously. The key thing that we want to keep in mind whenever we're doing a survey is we want that survey data to reflect the population that we're trying to learn about. And typically when it comes to psychology, we're trying to learn about people just in general. So what we would need is a good representative sample, a sample of people that represents the larger population. And one method of finding a good representative sample is to randomly select people. And here's where social psychology really has a problem. You will see, as we talk about different research studies throughout the semester, that most of the samples that are used to collect data come from America. And America only represents about 5% of the total the total world population. So it's a very small proportion of the world population. And furthermore, the social psychological studies that we'll read about, most of them pick samples from college students. So now we're making that sample even smaller. And if I'm trying to learn about people in general, these general truths about people around the world, I might not be able to learn that just from college students in America. So these are questions we need to ask ourselves when we evaluate research studies. Because remember, we want to be skeptical. We don't want to be cynical, but we want to be skeptical and ask questions about how the data was collected. All right, so we're done talking about descriptive research. Let's kind of bump it up a level. Let's now talk about correlational research. You'll notice when we were talking about descriptive research, we weren't even looking at associations between different variables. And correlational research does exactly that. Via correlational research, we try to assess relationships between variables. So for example, we might ask a question like this: is viewing TV violence related to aggressive behavior? And we're specifically interested in that when it comes to kids, because kids watch a lot of violent TV sometimes. They play violent video games. And of course, we're trying to teach them to be good human beings. We want them to learn a lot in school. We don't want them to have behavioral problems. So this is a big issue. And what we're really trying to know is, how well does one variable predict the other? So if I know how much violent TV this child is watching, will that give me some indication of how aggressive they act later on, like at school, on the playground, at home, wherever it might be? Now, what we do during these correlational research studies is collect data. Of course, I'm going to figure out how much TV in general these kids watch that is violent. And then I'm going to get some type of ratings also, maybe from their parents or from their teachers, about how aggressive they act. Or maybe we'll even watch them. We'll actually observe them firsthand. There's a variety of ways, of course, that we can collect the data. And what we're going to do is compute what we call a correlation coefficient. A coefficient is just a number. We're going to compute this value based on our data that will measure the strength and the direction of the relationship. Let me just give you a sample of how these correlation coefficients can look, and then we'll go over a couple examples in a minute. So a correlation coefficient is always going to range from -1 to 1. And if that value is positive, it simply means that there is a positive relationship between the variables. And a positive relationship in this case would mean that the more violent TV they watch, the more aggressive they act later on. Do you see how the two variables are moving in the same direction at the same time? So kids who do not watch a lot of violent TV, they do not act as aggressively. That's a positive correlation. And as that value, that correlation coefficient, comes closer to a +1, then we have a stronger relationship. It's easier to predict one variable from the other. Now, a negative relationship would produce a negative correlation coefficient. So a negative correlation coefficient would represent a relationship that's kind of antagonistic. When one variable increases in value, the other variable tends to decrease in value. So for example, what that would mean in this situation is, as kids are watching more violent TV, they're acting less aggressively later on at school, on the playground, at home, wherever it might be. And that would support what we call a catharsis explanation, that viewing violence helps you kind of get it out of your system. So of course, we would want to collect some data to see what type of a relationship there actually is. And in this case, as that correlation coefficient approaches a value of -1, that would represent a strong relationship. Well, values, these correlation coefficients that approach 0, represent no relationship. So if there was a very small number, a number very close to 0, when we crunch our data, that would imply that there's essentially no relationship between watching violent TV and later aggressive behavior. And what that means is, I really can't predict one from the other. So if I know that your child watches a lot of violent TV, it doesn't help me predict how aggressive they're going to act later on. So you see, with all these possibilities, it really makes sense that we need to collect some data and see which we're going to find support for. Let's look at a few scatter plots. You'll see what I mean in a second here. They help us better understand the nature of correlations and these coefficients that I'm talking about. So these are what we call scatter plots. Scatter plots just allow us to plot two different variables graphically so that we can then look at different data points and see if some type of trend line emerges. So let's first just talk about positive correlation so you can get a sense of that. In this particular example, we're looking at two variables, number of people who purchase cold drinks, and the daily temperature outside. So we're kind of getting away from psychology for a second just to keep things simple. And we can see here that as the temperature outside gets hotter, so as these values increase for temperature, then the number of people who are going to purchase drinks is going to increase from few to many. So if we ran some type of business and we knew it was going to be really hot outside, we can predict that more people are going to be buying our drinks. And that's because there's this very strong relationship that we see here. When we look at all these data points, we see that there's a trend that emerges. So each one of these dots represents a data point. So for example, right there, it represents a pretty darn hot day, and it represents that we sold a lot of drinks. So this data point right there represents a relatively cold day, and we sold very few cold drinks. So there's a trend that emerges. This would represent a positive correlation. The higher the temperature, the more drinks that we sell. The lower the temperature, the fewer drinks that we sell. Positive correlation. Now in this particular case, this trend would represent a pretty strong correlation. Remember, a positive correlation can have the highest value of 1, positive 1. So let's just assume that this data might represent a correlation of positive 0.85. That's pretty darn strong, and that would mean I have lots of predictive power. If I know what the temperature is going to be tomorrow, I can predict reasonably well how many drinks I'm going to sell. All right, let's talk about a negative correlation. In this particular case, you can see there's a downward trend between these two variables. Now we're talking about the number of people who are wearing sweaters outside and the temperature. And of course, as the temperature gets really hot, we can see that these people in here, there are very few of them wearing sweaters. So this data point represents a really hot day, and how many people were wearing sweaters that day? Very few. This data point right here represents a very cold day, and lots of people were wearing sweaters. So again, if for some reason I needed to predict how many sweaters people were going to be wearing, if I knew the temperature outside, I can predict the sweaters very well. So I have lots of predictive power. Now look at how this scatter plot is showing essentially no type of trend. This would be an example of essentially no relationship at all. This is the relationship between the temperature outside again, but now the number of people who have hiccups. And there's no theoretical reason for us to believe that those two things would be related. And in fact, if we took all this data and we crunched the numbers, we're likely to find a correlation approximately equal to 0. No relationship at all. And if there's no relationship at all, I have no predictive power. So if I know it's going to be really hot outside, does that help me predict how many people are going to have hiccups? No, because there seem to be about equal proportions of people having hiccups, whether it's hot or cold outside. All right, so those are just a couple examples there to help you understand what I'm talking about. All semester long, when we talk about correlational research, we crunch the numbers based on the variables that we measured to see what type of relationship there is between those variables. Let's talk about some of the pros and cons of correlational research. Remember, our goal is to understand different research methods, and to understand those methods, we need to know when they're appropriate. So we need to know the pros and the cons. So one good thing about correlational research is that many things we measure cannot be manipulated in an experiment. We're going to see experiments are great things, but not everything can be studied experimentally. So there are a variety of things that we have to study correlationally, which means all we can do is measure those variables and see how they're related. Things like a person's gender, male or female, a person's race. In social psychology, we do lots of research where we're looking at white subjects and black subjects to see if there are some differences, particularly regarding like stereotypes and discrimination. We might be looking at someone's age or their ethnicity. These are things that in a laboratory experiment, I cannot control. All I can do is measure those variables because people, of course, come to the research study with these things already intact. I cannot manipulate them in an experiment, and that's what experiments are all about. So the primary pro for correlational research is I can measure anything in a correlational study. Here are a couple other things that I might be interested in studying. Of course, I can't manipulate something like sexual abuse. That would be completely unethical. It would be illegal. Drug use, again, unethical, illegal. If I wanted to study the effects of drug use, I can't bring that into the laboratory and manipulate it and have some people randomly assigned to do drugs and other people randomly assigned to not do drugs. That would be a very rare type of study to be done. Typically not ethical, typically not legal. But can I ask people about the drugs that they've used? And then can I measure some other things to see if it's related? Like, for example, I can ask students about their drug use, and I can correlate that with their grades. I might find students who are really active in the drug world tend to have lower grades. That's a relationship that I find via correlational research. I could not study those variables together in an experiment because I can't manipulate your drug use. All right, so that's a really important thing. Another good thing about correlational research is I have the freedom to study natural behavior out there in the field, in the real world. So you're going to see that in experiments, I often really need a lot of control, but in correlational research, I'm just measuring variables. I don't need all that control. So I can study all kinds of things wherever they naturally exist. That's a good thing. What are some of the cons of correlational research? There are some serious drawbacks of correlational research, and this is the primary one. You've probably heard this phrase before. Correlation does not prove causation. And here's the point, and we'll go over an example in just a second so you'll really understand it, because it's important that you really understand it. As a psychology student, you should have a good grounding in understanding research methods, and this is one of the key lessons that you need to understand, why correlation doesn't prove causation. And here's the bottom line. Correlational research does not allow us to isolate and test one potential factor at a time. I mean, just think about what I was telling you before. If I was going to ask students how often they engage in drug activity, drug use, and then I were to also ask them about their grades or take some other type of measurement of their grades, and if I were to find that the students who do a lot of drugs have lower grades, have I proven that drug use causes lower grades? Not at all. I had no control over that study. There are all kinds of alternative explanations. It could be the students that do a lot of drugs don't study much at all, and that's why they have lower grades. It's not the drugs at all. It's just that they're not studying. Do you see how I'm unable to isolate and test one potential factor at a time? That's the biggest drawback of a correlational study. So if I'm unable to isolate and test one factor at a time, there are always other potential explanations and interpretations of my results. That's a problem. I can't figure out exactly what's going on if there are several plausible interpretations. Let's go through an example so you understand. We were talking about watching violence like on TV or playing violent video games, and then later on measuring a kid's aggressive behavior. Well, there are really three possibilities to explain a correlational result. One possibility is watching the violent games, playing the violent games, does indeed cause a kid to be more aggressive. All right, that's a very straightforward interpretation. But because I'm unable to isolate and test one variable at a time, because I don't have all that control that I would have in a true experiment, I could really flip it around. And it could be that aggressive kids are really interested in violent video games, and that's why they play them. They were aggressive to begin with, and they're just drawn to these violent video games. So the video games aren't causing their aggression at all. In fact, it's the aggression that's causing them to be interested in the violent video games. Do you see how that's a problem? I cannot isolate and test one variable at a time to figure out what's causing what. And here's another possibility. There could be some other outside variable, some third factor that we haven't even thought about that's related to an interest in video games and this tendency to act aggressively. Maybe kids who have family troubles at home, they find some type of solace in playing violent video games. And these kids who have family troubles at home, they also tend to act out and act more aggressively when at school and out on the schoolyard and at home. So you see, the video games aren't causing the aggression at all. There's some other factor that's related to both variables. Have I ruled that out? That's the critical question that we need to be asking ourselves. Would a correlational study rule out these alternative explanations of the results? And the answer is no. A correlational study would not rule out these alternative explanations. So that's obviously a drawback of correlational research. It's really quite valuable that we're able to learn that there's a relationship between watching violence and later on acting aggressively. That's great information for us to learn about human behavior. But it doesn't help us get to the point of learning what's causing that aggressive behavior. So how can we identify causal relationships? How can we get to that point? Because that's where we want to be. As researchers and consumers of research information, we really want to know specifically what's causing what. So next, let's start talking about experiments. Because as I was suggesting, in experiments, we have a lot of control. And in experiments, we will be able to isolate and test one factor at a time. Let's talk about some of the ins and outs of experiments. There are really two key characteristics of experiments. One key characteristic is that the researcher has a lot of control over the procedures that take place and the variables that we measure. Remember, we talked about Milgram and his research on obedience to authority. I mean, think about everything that we saw. I mean, he created a lab that was so intricate, and people had to run through a series of procedures that were all laid out and very well planned. He had complete control over that entire situation. Here's another key thing. The participants, that's what I mean by P's there, the participants in the study are randomly assigned to the groups. So the experimenter is deciding who's going to be in one group and who's going to be in another group. And later on, they're going to compare these groups. So for example, you might recall that we talked about Milgram testing a variety of different factors that are related to obedience. And in his original study, the teacher was shocking a learner who was back in another room. Well, Milgram was interested in seeing, would people be just as obedient if that learner was being shocked right there, right next to him, where the teacher had to force the learner's hand onto a shock plate. Now, most of you would probably predict that we would find less obedience in this condition, in that group, compared to the people in this group. Well, Milgram wanted to make sure that there are equal types of people in both groups, and that's why he randomly assigned people to those two groups. So that everything is the same in these studies. There are the same types of people in these two different groups that we're studying, and there's one key thing that's different, and that's that in this particular group, the people are shocking someone in another room, and in this particular group, they're shocking someone who's right next to them. So let's talk about some of the terminology that we use in these experiments. That thing that's being manipulated, the learner is either in another room or the learner is in the same room. You see how that's being manipulated in this study? We call that the independent variable. And then the thing that we measure, their obedience, is what we call the dependent variable. So what we're trying to do is see, does that independent variable, the location of the learner, have some effect on the level of obedience that these teachers are going to exhibit? So I want to see if the independent variable has an effect on the dependent variable. So if we're talking about those types of variables, we're talking about true experiments. If we're talking about a situation where we have all this control, where people are randomly assigned to groups, we're talking about a true experiment. Now, sometimes when we are analyzing the data, we look at some other variables. So we might look at what we call subject variables. And what we're doing in that situation is looking to see if the independent variable might have some differing effects on the obedience rates in this situation. So for example, the sex of a subject would be a subject variable. The race of a subject would be a subject variable. The socioeconomic status, whether they're rich or poor, would be a subject variable. Let's look at sex for a second. Let's go back a couple steps here. Milgram might think that, like, when it comes to this situation, males and females are likely to show the same type of obedience. And in fact, that's what he found in his original research. But he might be thinking that when you put males and females in this situation, the males are going to be more likely to be obedient, but the females will be less likely because they tend to be more passive in general, less physically aggressive than men. And in order to actually put someone's hand on that shock plate, that requires some type of physical maneuver. So he might have an idea that the person's sex is going to make a difference in this type of situation. In that situation, he would be studying a subject variable. So I just wanted to make sure that you are aware of that, that when it comes to an experiment, we can study all different types of variables. Let me give you an example of a really cool experiment. Just imagine a presidential debate, and this particular experiment showed people video from a 1984 presidential debate between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. And in this particular debate, Reagan had some witty one-liners that went over pretty well with the audience. And of course, if you're zinging your opponent and the audience is laughing, you're doing pretty well in the debate. You're going to look good. So when people, the research subjects, were viewing an unedited example, an unedited segment of that tape, they rated Reagan pretty highly. Now, people were randomly assigned to see one of 3 segments from this debate. So here would be the first group right here. The second group saw that exact same segment, but the jokes and then the reaction of the audience when they were laughing, that was all edited out. And you can see that they rated Reagan almost exactly as highly. All right, so we can see here the jokes and the reaction from the audience, they essentially had no effect, because you can take all that out and the people are still rating President Reagan as pretty high, pretty strong. But now here's where it gets really interesting. A third group of people was randomly assigned to watch the exact same tape. The jokes were left in, but the reaction of the audience was edited out. So just imagine what it would be like. You'd hear Reagan zinging, trying to zing Mondale with one of those one-liners, but nobody laughs. So now as a viewer of that video, you're thinking, wow, that fell flat. And now you're starting to think like, well, maybe Ronald Reagan isn't as slick as he thinks he is. And you can see here they don't rate him very highly at all compared to the other groups. That is a great example of a true experiment. People were randomly assigned to one of these 3 groups. They manipulated in this experiment just this primary factor of if the jokes and the reaction were included. And then everybody was in the same type of situation, watching the same video and answering the same types of questions. So if we see differences between the groups, we can really tell what's going on. And what we can tell what's going on right here is people are really influenced by the reaction of the audience. There are some other features of experiments that we should talk about to make sure that you have a good sense of what we can do in an experiment. Experiments can take place in laboratories, of course, but they can also take place in the field. Let's talk about laboratory settings. Milgram's research, of course, took place in a laboratory, and this would be a good example where everything's kind of closed off and we've got lots of control what's going on. And that, of course, is the primary incentive of doing laboratory research, and that's that we have a lot of control over the situation. We can put people in identical experimental conditions and we can measure things very precisely. But there is a drawback. If I'm really trying to learn about obedience to authority, am I going to learn a lot about it from this type of situation? Remember, Milgram's original motivation was to try to understand the real world. Why would people be so obedient during war situations when they're asked to carry out horrific crimes like killing people who are completely innocent, putting them in gas chambers, shooting them when they're completely innocent and unarmed? Why would people do that? That's what we were trying to learn about via Milgram's research. And you got to ask yourself, well, are we learning about that type of real world situation when we're studying people in a laboratory context like this? So one problem is the laboratory environment can be a little bit too artificial. Well, the good news is, of course, we could do field research. And field research is looking in real world settings. So if I'm trying to learn about obedience to authority during wartime situations, maybe I'm going to study military personnel during a wartime situation. So that's one really nice feature of field research. But although I'm getting natural measurements of people's behaviors because they are being carried out naturally in the environment, it's not easy to do a controlled experiment in those situations. So field research that is experimental tends to be much more rare. It's just simply very difficult to carry out. There's a lot going on in the real world and I can't control it. And what do I need to do in an experiment? I need to have a reasonable level of control. So just keep that in mind. A couple other terms that come up as we're talking about experiments have to do with validity, internal and external validity. Let's talk about internal validity. In order for an experiment to really teach us something, it needs to be internally valid. And what that means is we need to be reasonably sure that the independent variable is what caused the changes in the dependent variable. Let me give you an example here. Remember, we realized that when we edited out the reaction of the audience, people rated Reagan much more negatively, really. They didn't rate him as positively. So we realized that that reaction was really important, because if he told a joke and they didn't hear any type of reaction from the audience, it seems like his joke fell flat. He's not doing really well with people. He's not connecting with them. Well, how can we be sure that the rating for Reagan was really due to having that reaction edited out? Couldn't it just be that maybe there were older people in these two conditions, and they're more likely to like Reagan's humor, but there were younger people in this condition, and they're interested in a different level of humor, they're younger people, and that's why they rated him more negatively? Is that possible? And that would be a real problem with our study, right? But my point is that's very unlikely, because remember, we randomly assigned people to these conditions. So when it comes to average age, we'd expect to see the same average age approximately in each one of those groups. So my point is this study has strong internal validity. If there's going to be a difference between these groups, it's got to be due to that one thing that we manipulated. And what did we manipulate? If the jokes and the reaction of the audience was included. And it's only in this situation where the reaction of the audience was not included, and it's in this situation where they didn't see Reagan as favorably. So we can be reasonably sure that's why they rated Reagan more negatively. So in other words, that study has strong internal validity. Now, if that study did not have strong internal validity, we would say that our results are confounded. And what it means when we say our results are confounded, it means that they're confused. So just imagine for a second, let's go back, that there really were younger people in this group and older people in these groups. Now we don't know why they gave Reagan a relatively negative rating in this condition. Did they give Reagan a negative rating because they didn't hear the reactions and they felt that he fell flat? Or did they give Reagan a negative rating because they're younger and they're interested in a different type of humor? Do you see how that's a problem? That would be a confound. We would be confused about the results. Well, the good news is that study was designed so that it eliminated all those confounds. It was internally valid. All right, so I hope that you're getting that basic point. External validity is a little bit more straightforward. When it comes to external validity, we're asking the question, will our results generalize to some different set of circumstances outside of the laboratory, outside of this research study? Will our results generalize? So think about Milgram's research on obedience to authority. Will his results from the lab generalize to like a military situation in the real world? Well, that's a real good question. There are a variety of factors that we should think about when we're trying to determine if a research study would have results that generalize to the larger world. One question we can ask ourselves is, did the researcher study a representative sample? Well, in Milgram's case, the answer is pretty much no. He started off initially with a pretty small sample to begin with, and it included, a lot of people that are kind of like this guy, middle-aged, there were men, there were women. He did have a variety of people. Some people were actually in the military, some people were like factory workers, some people were business executives. But he did not have a large enough sample and enough diversity in that sample to really call it a representative sample. So already we need to ask ourselves, would his results apply to a more diverse group of people? And not really completely sure at this point. There are some other things, some other factors that we want to think about when we're trying to determine if some results will generalize. And one has to do with what we call mundane realism. Mundane realism is asking the question, is this type of research situation set up in such a way that it closely resembles a real-world situation? And we've already talked about this fact that Milgram's study is nothing like a real-world situation. There is nothing in the real world that is comparable to what happens in this research scenario. So it's very low on mundane realism. What happens in the lab is not like what's going on in the real world. Now, of course, a research study that is low on mundane realism, we would need to question to the extent to which it's externally valid. Another thing that we want to figure out is there what we call experimental realism? And experimental realism has to do with the fact that some research studies are really very engaging. And if they are very engaging, they're likely to elicit spontaneous responses from the participants that are valid and truthful of real behavior. And in Milgram's study, you remember these people were really engaged. I mean, they believed exactly what was going on. And some of them were upset and just really worried about what was happening. So we do have good reason to believe there that there was a lot of experimental realism, and the behaviors that we were looking at in the lab were true behaviors that people would exhibit potentially, like outside the laboratory. So do you see how there are a variety of factors that we want to think about when determining if the results of a laboratory study would generalize to the outside world? And it's not like everything lines up like ducks in a row. There are some things that are related to Milgram's study that look like they would generalize pretty good. And there are some factors that look like, wouldn't generalize quite as well. And the key problem is mundane realism. What he did in the lab, it's not like what happens in the real world. So of course, when it comes to studying obedience, we would want to do some more research that's closer to what happens in the real world. All right, well, those are all issues of external validity. All right, we're getting close to being done here. You might have noticed that a lot of social psychologists do research where they're not always completely honest with their subjects. So let's talk about deception in these experiments. Deception, as it's pretty obvious to you, I assume, involves providing the participants with false information about the experiment. Now, obviously, in Milgram's study, he provided people with false information about the experiment. The subject in the experiment thought that he or she was going to be involved in a study about memory, and specifically how punishment might influence a person to learn information. Now, of course, that's not what the study was about at all. And remember, we had a Confederate. This guy was working for Milgram. All right, so it was all a setup. But you can see it can make the experiment much more realistic. So one reason why deception is used in experiments is to really increase that realism. Because if I'm trying to learn about obedience, I can't set up a situation where they think that they're just pretending they're shocking someone. Then I'm not going to really learn about their true behavior. But if I create a situation where they really feel they are delivering electric shocks to someone, I'm going to learn some important information about how obedient people will be in that type of situation. Here's another important thing. You'd think that in the end, some people might be kind of upset. They'd be like, oh, you tricked me. But really, people find it kind of interesting. And I think I would too. If I was involved in a study that involved deception, I think I would just think it's so fascinating. It just makes it incredibly interesting. It's not something that happens to you every day. So research has found that there are typically no hard feelings, and people usually enjoy being involved in experiments that involve deception. It does, though, create some ethical concerns. Because think about it this way. When people are involved in a research study, we have to see if they are willing to consent to continue being involved in the study. And the only way that they can provide informed consent to being involved in the study is to know what the study is about. Now, if I'm lying to them about what the study is about, how can they really provide me with informed consent? So that's a problem. That is definitely an ethical issue. Another thing that we have to keep in mind when it comes to ethics is after some study is performed that involves deception, later on we need to come clean, right? We need to give them a debriefing. And always at the end of studies that involve deception, the researcher will let the subject know what the study was really about so that they can learn something about the research and so that they won't walk away thinking that they might have done something wrong. I mean, just imagine in Milgram's study, if the people went home and they were never told that they were not shocking the learner, they might feel really bad about what they just did. Now, they might go home still feeling really bad about what they just did, even after they find out the truth, but at least they'll know they didn't really harm somebody. And they'll probably learn a lot about themselves in that process. So a debriefing is completely necessary. Here's a slide that talks about some of the similarities and differences here between correlational and experimental research. You can always look at that in your book or stop the video and look at that in more detail. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that correlational and experimental research, both good methods, they have their time and their place, their pros and their cons. You want to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of each type of research design. All right, let's talk about one final topic, and that is statistical significance. You're going to see that your book is filled with results of research studies, and those research studies almost always have found statistically significant results, and that's why we're paying attention to them. So the first thing to keep in mind is when results are statistically significant, we usually take them seriously. What it means when we have statistically significant results is that it's very unlikely to have found those results just by chance. So for example, think about Reagan's study again. You can see that the people who were in the three different conditions, they were either watching the video that had the jokes and the reactions, they were watching the video that had the jokes and the reactions edited out, or they were watching the video where the jokes were left in, but the reaction was edited out. There are some differences between the groups. Sometimes the differences are small, sometimes they're larger. Now, because we have three different groups of people in this study, we'd expect there to be some differences between the bars, even if they all watched the exact same video. And that's just due to what we call sampling error, because there are, of course, different people in the three groups, and they're going to react a little bit differently. Well, I want to be able to say, though, that this bar is as low as it is. They gave Reagan a negative rating because they heard those jokes and they heard them fall flat. So can I rule out the possibility that this bar is low simply because of the people who are in this group? If I can rule that out, then I can say with confidence that the differences that exist are probably due to the thing we manipulated, and that's the type of video that they watched. So again, think about what I'm talking about. Statistically significant results are results that are unlikely to have occurred by chance. They're unlikely to have occurred simply due to the people that we had in each group. So if I can rule that out, rule out what we call sampling error, I can say with a lot of confidence that the results must be due to our independent variable, the thing we manipulated, the type of video they watched. To what extent do I have to rule it out? Well, I have to say it's incredibly unlikely that the results occurred just by chance. How unlikely? The probability, P, must be less than 5%. So if the probability of finding those results by chance is very small, if the probability of finding those results by chance is less than 5%, I have statistically significant results. And for purposes of our class, that just simply means we can essentially trust those results. We should put our faith in those results. Statistical significance is a complicated thing, and that's all we really need to understand at this point. If our results are statistically significant, we have essentially ruled out the possibility of finding those results by chance. All right, I guess I lied. There is one more topic that we have to talk about, and that is replication and meta-analysis. Remember, from any individual study, we can only learn so much information. So it's smart to conduct replication studies, studies that are studying the same thing in the same way to see if we find similar types of results, just to establish some reliability. Well, meta-analyses are related to that because meta-analyses allow us to take a variety of similar studies and pull them all together to find out overall what's going on. Meta-analyses essentially allow us to get a better estimate of two things: the overall reliability of the result, in other words, how consistent are the results. So let's say we pull together a variety of research studies that are very similar, that are studying watching violent TV and later aggressive behavior. If we take a variety of those individual research studies and put them together, we can have a good sense of how consistent the results are. And then, of course, by pulling them together, we can also have a sense of the effect sizes of those research studies. In other words, how big or important are those results? Well, by putting multiple studies together, we'll have a more reliable estimate of that effect size. So meta-analysis has become an important tool in a social psychologist's toolbox. All right, I think we're done. I know this was a long section. Thank you for your attention. Stay tuned. There is more social psychology coming up soon.